Okay, let's kick off. Can you introduce yourself for the tape?
My name is David Kessler. I am a pediatrician. I have had the privilege of taking on a number of public health issues over my career.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us because you've been a consistent voice on the topic of our conversation today. In fact, you started one of the first earlier books you wrote about 15 years ago now was called The End of Overeating. And you wrote about hyperpalatability of processed foods and how food manufacturers have sort of cracked the code on putting salt, sugar, and fat together to make foods that much more hyperpalatable and that much more irresistible. You came back to the topic in your most recent book, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of help us bridge your thinking over the past 15 years. How have breakthroughs in science changed the way you think about this issue?
A wonderful question. It actually goes back before that book. Back when I was FDA Commissioner, we did the food label. So that was really the first effort to give consumers information about what they were eating. We even won the National Endowments for the Arts, gave us the Presidential Design Award for the food label. It gave the whole team, and I wondered why give us the Presidential Design Award? It's for great graphic artists, for architects, and the reason they gave us the award was to be able to convey, important information in a very small amount of space, right? But what was the information? I mean, at that time, people, didn't have that information. It was calories, fat, sugar, and salt. I then had the privilege of going inside for the first time the tobacco industry, completely different effort while we were at FDA, and had to learn everything about addiction and what they knew. Left FDA, but there was when I was there learning everything about addiction, one thing that struck me was, how animals will press a lever, for a reinforcing substance. It's actually called self-administration. Right? And nicotine, drugs of abuse, it's how DEA, NIH, FDA decides whether to label something a controlled substance. Is it self-administered? And one of the sort of control arms to those experiments, was sucrose. So they had animals pressing levers for sucrose, and I always said, "Why are you using sucrose?" And I never got a real answer. Right? So I became very interested in what drives overeating, and at the core of that, is highly palatable foods, right? And those foods are designed in such a way. Industry will say they design it for bliss point, but that optimal pleasure point, and they can achieve it by fat and sugar, fat and salt, fat, sugar, and salt. That work, I think, started, the next decade and a half, spawned a lot of work on how food, especially highly palatable food, affects the reward circuits of the brain. Right? Prior to that, most of us were taught, right? I don't know about you, in physiology, the homeostatic systems, but here we're talking about the hedonic systems, the addictive circuits of the brain, the rewarding circuits of the brain. So that spawned a lot of research. That show that those highly palatable substances can trigger the reinforcing reward addictive circuits of the brain over the last decade and a half. The reason I did this book, we all went through your leadership. I had the opportunity to co-lead Operation Warp Speed. And 676 million vaccines, pretty intense period for all of us. I didn't leave my computer. We all worked. I worked 18-hour days for 2-3 years, and I found myself, at the end of that, 40 pounds heavier than when I started. Right, and it was simply stress. I eat to calm myself. I eat to I mean, if I need energy, if I need to keep on working, from the point where I was a kid, I would reach for food. But I really wanted to, after COVID, go spend the next 2 years studying weight and what was driving weight. And what became very apparent to me, and if you ask what the thesis of the book is really about, what the thesis is, it's not how big we are or small we are. It's this visceral fat, this central metabolically active fat, call it sick fat or toxic fat. It's the fat that accumulates in the abdomen that surrounds and even invades certain layers of the liver, of the pancreas, and of the heart, and is in the causal chain. And this is something I don't think many docs realize. We all knew weight wasn't good for us, right? We always knew it was a risk factor, but we didn't know that it was causal. So if you look at the vast majority of cardiometabolic diseases, if you look at 13 forms of cancer, you look at some forms of dementia, diabetes, certainly. I mean, there's over 200 diseases. Visceral fat, I mean, is probably the number one driver of chronic disease in this country. And then the question is, what can you do about it?
One of the things I really love about this book is that it lands in the midst of almost a codification of a set of understandings, right? The first is, that there's now a name for what you sort of put a point to in the end of overeating, which we now call ultra processed foods, right? And we've got a little bit more science to demonstrate some of the pathways by which this is a problem. And then you specifically call out the role of dopamine and the way that our society has built so much of itself and organized us in ways to maximize dopamine, and then the connection to that between those two things and metabolically active fats. I want to stop for a second here on this dopamine forward society piece, because food is not the only sort of dopamine release that we optimize around. You think about the rise of online betting. You think about smartphones and social media. You think about our food systems. Like all of these sort of go back to this way to sell us things at the edge of getting a different kind of dopamine hit. And the irony of this is that you'd think that so much dopamine would quench our thirst for it, but ironically, it doesn't. Can you talk a little bit about this sort of this insatiable dopamine need and the ways that we've sort of built a society around it and the implications that has?
Again, the question is spot on. I think we have to admit that dopamine is really a surrogate for a range of neurochemical compounds and neural pathways, so we don't fully understand, right? And let's agree on a few things first. I don't think food is the same thing as cocaine or amphetamines. There are certain substances that markedly hijack the dopamine circuits, amphetamine, cocaine. You don't see those rise, that same degree of rise with these highly palatable foods. You see a rise, but not off the charts with amphetamine and cocaine. But neither do you see it with nicotine, right? And I certainly, in my own experience, find myself, if I just observe when I eat, right, and how I eat through the day, I'm almost grazing. I mean, I use food to calm myself. I use food to sort of focus my attention, to stimulate. I mean, very much such that, if I, grew up 30 years earlier, I probably would have been a smoker and used nicotine in the same kind of way throughout the day to change, how I feel. But I think you're the key part of your question. If you look at what dopamine does, I mean, there are three real parts of addiction, and I think we have to realize that addiction's not for the weak. It's not for the downtrodden. I mean, it's really, those addictive circuits are part of all of us, right? But what are those components? I mean, the first component is what's cue-induced wanting. Something captures my attention. It could be out of my conscious, but that cue, whether it's a time of day, whether it's location, it's a smell, it's an internal feeling. That cue-induced wanting, I think, is a major component of these processes. The second component is craving. That cue-induced wanting stimulates a craving, a preoccupation. Look, I can eat anytime, and I can keep on going. I don't have that craving. It's only when you take it away from me, that absence of it, right, that I really experience that craving. And third is relapse, right? The one thing is, once those circuits are laid down, they're laid down for a long period of time. I mean, they are there. And one of the things that always sort of puzzled me, and I think puzzled a lot of the medical community, is that every time anyone loses weight, eventually they gain it back. I mean, that's in part because there's metabolic adaptation, but it's also there's an increased appetite after you lose that weight. And I think that's because those reward pathways, those addictive pathways, those dopamine pathways are still there. But I think we have to be careful that we just don't say this is just dopamine. Mm. But to your point, I could be captured, by a lot of different stimuli. What is it that captures me? It's the most salient stimuli in my environment. I mean, food was sort of the first addiction. I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, it was energy dense. I needed it to survival. I mean, if I'm a bird and I'm flying over, I mean, I have to find that food and know where that prey is to be able to survive. So those circuits evolve for a reason. But for each of us, what that salient stimuli end up being can be different. But my guess is that there's one common denominator, and it's that they change how we feel. So anything that can change how you feel, right? Anything that can make me feel better, right? Anything that can calm me, anything that can distract me, has the ability to become a salient stimuli and capture my attention and those circuits.